Hello there. The British government wants to take over 4,000 EU regulations and change them or delete them altogether. Parliamentarians, consumer advocates, and trade unionists are alarmed. But let's first talk about anyone in Europe who opens the fridge and takes food and is relying on the EU with every bite. In Great Britain, this will soon be different. According to a new law, thousands of EU regulations are to be either incorporated into British law by the end of the year or simply expire. Industry associations, trade unions, and non governmental organizations fear that this will have serious consequences. For example, when it comes to food, EU regulations regulate, among other things, that the packaging states what is actually contained in the food. Allergens must also be pointed out. The ordinances also stipulate that meat products may only be decontaminated using approved methods, and that chicken, for example, are not treated with chlorine. EU law obliges the food industry to maintain a minimum of hygiene. In Great Britain, it's now suddenly unclear which of these regulations should still apply in the long term. The decisive factor is whether the so-called retained EU law bill now also passes the House of Lords after it has been approved in the House of Commons. The law gives the government and departments the right to amend 4,000 EU regulations still in force in the country at their own discretion and incorporate them into British law. Otherwise, the regulations expire at the end of December 23. The new law refers to regulations from the time of the UK's EU membership. These are legal acts that the EU enacts and that apply directly in the member countries. Anyone can see which regulations are under discussion on a website. They are not to be confused with the laws that Great Britain had to introduce, for example, in order to transpose EU directives into national law, and in the implementation of which Parliament was involved. For the hardliners in the Conservative Party, the abolition of former EU law is one of the most important steps in cementing Brexit. They want to position the country legally in such a way that a long-term return to the European Economic Area will be difficult, if not impossible. This explains the haste with which the bill is being pushed through Parliament. Finally, election polls suggest that there could be a change of government at the next general election in 2024 or 5, and Labour could then look to work more closely with the EU. As long as UK regulations and standards do not deviate too much from EU regulations, trade between the two can work. The more British industry diverges, the more difficult the trade relationship between the two sides will become. And the new Prime Minister is also celebrating the abolition of EU law as a Brexit success. When he ran for office, Rishi Sunak promised to throw EU regulations into the shredder within 100 days. And Brexit hardliner Jacob Rees-Mogg then used his position as business secretary to push the controversial law through. He wrote in the Telegraph newspaper that all the EU laws and regulations come from an EU system that isn't working anyway. It's only making Europe and the rest of the world poorer, which is complete bullshit, JRM. The costly anti-competitive and anti-innovation regulations are only there to protect bankrupt companies from insolvency. What a bull. They were imposed on Great Britain by the EU. Not a word that EU law was drafted with the participation of British representatives in Brussels. Because Brexit gives us freedom, we absolutely have to deviate from this EU model, is what Rees-Mogg said in the House of Commons. Oh boy. According to estimates by state officials, combing through this mass of law in such a short time is not possible. But even moderate Tories consider the action to be completely excessive. For the Institute of Directors, the Association of UK Business Leaders, it's a costly distraction from real problems. Prime Minister Sunak, however, has not dared to step in the arms of the right wing on which he feels dependent. It's not only a feeling. At the same time, the head of government finds himself under considerable pressure from the same hardliners and militant Northern Irish unionists over the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol, which is part of the Brexit deal with the EU. The divorce deal, not the other. The Prime Minister instinctively seeks a compromise with the EU on this issue so as not to burden himself with even more trade problems. And on some issues, such as controlling certain flows of goods to Northern Ireland, London and Brussels have recently came a little bit closer. But it's still uncertain whether Sunak, for example, will be able to accept the further say of the European Court of Justice on everything on the single market applying to the North. The real showdown in the Tory party on the Northern Ireland Protocol is still yet to come. There isn't much time to negotiate anything with the EU now. US President Joe Biden will make a visit to the UK in April, making the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and he will make this conditional on such a compromise. Remarkably, not only the government but also the main opposition party is turning a deaf ear to the complaints of businesses and the growing doubts of voters. Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, has issued the slogan not to say the B word in their own ranks. The rationale is that Labour can only win next year's general election if it wins back the pro-Brexit working class. It has lost to the Tories in 2019 in the so-called Red War. Starmer believes that he cannot afford to rekindle the bitter confrontation over the exit issue. Even the thoroughly pro-European Liberal Democrats are holding back for reasons of electoral tactics and currently prefer to talk about other things than relations with the European Union. Only the Scottish National Party, the SNP, does not have to remain silent. The SNP government in Edinburgh wants to lead Scotland out of the United Kingdom and straight back into the EU. But other opposition politicians consider it absurd that the B word should be practically taboo on the political stage. London's Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan, for example, believes that after 2 years of denial and evasion, they must now face the hard truth, namely that Brexit is not working. Pollsters like Professor Rob Ford of the University of Manchester assume that the idea of a rapprochement with the EU will only have a real chance if 70 to 75% of the voters are in favour and both party leaderships support a corresponding plan. Only then will the EU, which has become quite skeptical now, open the door again, as Ford suspects. And I can tell you, they have to do much more to find any open doors in the EU again. There are so many member countries now so peed off by the British government's behavior and the breaking of international law that closer ties with the EU will be a really tough thing. Because despite what they're always denying, that Britain all the time had the chance to influence all the new laws in the EU, they had a fracking veto right in the council. So what are they complaining about? There is no law that they didn't agree. But it will be an interesting time in the future. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.